It happened on a night like any other, a night where silence wrapped the house in a tight embrace and the only sounds were the faint rustles of the wind against the window panes. But what unfolded within those walls was anything but ordinary. My name is Mia, and this is a story I've never shared before. It's the kind of story that lingers in the shadows of your mind, a tale of secrets, temptations, and choices that change everything. My uncle Ethan had come to stay with us for a while. He wasn't just any uncle. He was the enigmatic one, the one with stories of adventures, charm that seemed to drip from his words, and an aura that drew people in. He was older than me by nearly 2 decades, but there was something about him that made it impossible not to notice him, to feel his presence like a gravitational pull. That evening, after dinner, Ethan excused himself early, saying he was tired from his travels. He disappeared into the guest room, and I thought that would be the end of it. But as the hours passed, I found myself unable to sleep. My mind wandered, restless and searching, and somehow it always circled back to him. To the way he laughed, the way his eyes lingered just a little too long, and the way my pulse quickened when he was near. It wasn't right. I knew that. He was family, after all. But logic has a way of losing its grip when emotions run wild. And that night, my emotions were a storm I couldn't control. Unable to resist the pull, I crept downstairs, my footsteps soft against the wooden floor. The house was dark, save for a sliver of light spilling out from the gap beneath his door. My heart pounded in my chest as I stood there, frozen in place, torn between retreating to the safety of my room and satisfying the curiosity that burned within me. Before I could decide, the door opened. Ethan stood there, his expression unreadable, his gaze locking onto mine. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked, his voice low, almost a whisper. I shook my head, unable to find the words. He stepped aside, silently inviting me in, and I followed, feeling as though I'd crossed an invisible line the moment I entered that room. The air was heavy, charged with an energy that made my skin prickle. He gestured for me to sit, and I did, perching on the edge of the bed while he leaned against the dresser, watching me with an intensity that made my breath hitch. "What's on your mind?" he asked, his tone casual but his eyes anything but. I hesitated, unsure of how to answer. Could I tell him the truth? That he was the one occupying my thoughts? That he'd awakened something in me I didn't fully understand? Instead, I shrugged, trying to play it off. Just restless, I guess. He nodded, a small smile tugging at the corner of his lips. Restlessness can be dangerous. It makes you do things you wouldn't normally do. His words hung in the air, heavy with implication. My pulse quickened, and I felt heat rise to my cheeks. Was he talking about me? About us? Or was my mind twisting his words into something they weren't? The tension in the room was suffocating, and yet I didn't want to leave. I didn't want to break whatever spell had been cast between us. Ethan took a step closer, and I felt my resolve weaken. "Mia," he said softly, his voice like a caress. "You can tell me anything." Those words were my undoing. Before I could think, before I could stop myself, I blurted out the truth. "You're what's on my mind." The room fell silent, the weight of my confession pressing down on us like a physical force. Ethan's expression shifted, surprise flickering across his features before something darker, something more primal, took its place. He closed the distance between us, his hand reaching out to cup my cheek. "Mia," he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. "This isn't—" But he didn't finish the sentence. Instead, his lips found mine, and the world around us faded into nothingness. The kiss was electric, a spark that ignited a fire I couldn't control. My hands found their way to his shoulders, his chest, memorizing the feel of him, the strength beneath my fingertips. Time seemed to stand still as we lost ourselves in each other. The boundaries we'd crossed, the lines we'd blurred. None of it mattered in that moment. All that mattered was the connection, the intensity, the way he made me feel alive in a way I never had before. When we finally pulled apart, breathless and trembling, reality came crashing back in. Ethan stepped away, running a hand through his hair, his expression a mix of regret and longing. "Mia, this can't happen," he said, his voice strained. "It's not right." I nodded, tears welling in my eyes. I knew he was right, but that didn't make it any easier. The pain of rejection, the weight of guilt, and the lingering desire all collided, leaving me feeling raw and exposed. The days that followed were tense, filled with stolen glances and unspoken words. We avoided being alone together, each of us trying to pretend that nothing had happened. But the memory of that night lingered, a constant reminder of what we'd shared and what we couldn't have. And then, just as suddenly as he'd come into my life, Ethan was gone. He packed his bags, leaving without a word, without an explanation. I was left to pick up the pieces, to grapple with the emotions he'd stirred within me and the emptiness he'd left behind. Looking back, I'm not sure if I regret what happened. It was a moment of weakness, of giving in to temptation, but it was also a moment of connection, of passion, of feeling truly seen. And though it's a story I'll never share aloud, it's one I'll carry with me forever.